This video is for Unit 4.3 on the cell cycle. Now in class you looked a little bit at the process of mitosis, which is just the splitting of a cell. The nuclear information in a cell's nucleus splits in half and goes into two different cells. But that's not all there is to a cell's life. Just like humans have many stages of development and growth, so do cells. So we're going to look at the whole cycle in this video. The first question I want to get at though is, why do cells have to go through a cell cycle? So the first reason why cells might go through the cell cycle and end up dividing is for growth. And by growth we mean growth of the organism. So you started out as a baby and you're gradually growing into an adult. And that doesn't happen by getting bigger and bigger and bigger cells. Instead, that happens by getting more and more and more cells of the same size. So what started out as one egg became 2 cells, which became 4 cells, which became 8 cells, and so forth and so on. And that's what we call growth. That's how you got from a little tiny 8-pound baby to who you are today. When this growth gets a little wacky and a little out of control, we call that a tumor. So a tumor is uncontrolled cell growth. And when this tumor is really out of control, we give it another name, which is cancer. We'll talk more about that later in class as well. So this picture just shows you an example of an actual embryo that's dividing. So it started out as 1 cell and then split into 2. And as I said, the next step is going to be making these each split again into 4 and so forth and so on, and it'll eventually grow up into an adult sand dollar. So all organisms go through some sort of mitosis for growth for the most part. There are a few single-celled organisms that don't, but anything that starts small and gets bigger has to go through this growth phase. The next reason that cells might need to divide is for repair. So this is reason number 2. So repair could mean a lot of different things. It could mean regeneration. For example, sea stars, maybe call them starfish, can regenerate arms. So if one of their arms breaks off, they can grow that back. Some lizards can regenerate their tails. We're okay at regenerating some tissue. For example, in humans, we can mend skin, we can repair blood vessels, we can repair bone, or we can get some more skin cells when the other ones have gone away. For example, in the winter when it's really dry, you lose a lot of skin, so you have to replace those skin cells. So repair is really important for that. Along with that, the immune system makes new cells for repair through this process as well. This is just a picture, again, of that immune system working here. We've got some bone marrow cells. These are 2 white blood cells, actually, in the bone marrow that are dividing. They're making copies of themselves so that they can make more white blood cells to help fight off infection. The third reason, this should be a 3, why cells might divide is for reproduction. So there are 2 types of reproduction that organisms typically use. One is called asexual reproduction, and the other is sexual reproduction. Whenever you see an A in front of a word, that usually means not. So simply asexual reproduction is not sexual reproduction. But if we defined it, our definition would be when a daughter cell, we talked about this term in class, this is the new cell that is formed, is identical to the parent cell. This is not talking about like daughters that are people being identical to their parents. This is one cell splitting in half to make copies of itself, or you could think of it kind of as like little clones of that cell. So sea stars do this. When they reproduce, they go through asexual reproduction. Most bacteria, some fungi will do that. So to make new copies of their cells to send out into the world for reproduction, all they do is go through this splitting, this asexual reproduction, where one cell becomes 2. Now, if that is not sexual reproduction, what is sexual reproduction? This is when the daughter cell is actually a combination of 2 parent cells. So we're pretty familiar with how this works in humans. We have 1 egg and 1 sperm come together to make 1 cell. But almost all animals and most plants actually go through this as well. So plants will release a cell, for example, a pollen spore, and that will land on another plant and fertilize it. So the male and the female cells get together and they create a new cell, which we call the seed. So not only animals go through sexual reproduction, but a lot of plants do as well. Take note of these diagrams. Hopefully this will help you remember the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. Here's an example of asexual reproduction. This is an amoeba, which is a protist that's found in like pond water and stuff like that. And it was once a single cell, so this was the whole cell, but now it's starting to split into 2. So this would be 1 parent cell splitting into 2 daughter cells, so making a copy of itself or a clone. So again, this would be the asexual reproduction. All right, now we're going to move on to what the cell cycle actually is. So talked about the reasons for the cell cycle, why we might need it for growth, for repair, for reproduction. Now let's talk about how that actually happens. In class, we discussed mitosis. Mitosis is actually only one of 2 parts of a cell's life cycle. So let's start with the new part that you haven't discussed yet in class, and that part is called interphase. So under your 2 phases, phase 1 is called interphase, inter meaning between. So it's the phase between mitotic phases, or between mitosis. Interphase is further divided into 3 parts: gap 1, synthesis, and gap 2. So I'll briefly talk about what happens in each of these steps. So gap 1 of interphase, or G1, is when the cell is growing. So it's getting bigger. It's getting more cytoplasm, it's making more ribosomes, it's growing up and getting bigger and getting more structures. Then, after it goes through that period of growth, it moves into a new period called synthesis. And synthesis always means to make something. In this case, the cell is making sister chromatids. And I'll talk about those sister chromatids are in a minute because I want to talk about this picture right over here, and I'll get to that. And then finally, the last part of interphase is the step called gap 2. And in gap 2, the cell makes something called centrioles. And this is something else I'll discuss more of later. For now, just get that into your notes. Okay, let's talk about these sister chromatids. So when DNA is in the cell during interphase, typically it just kind of looks like a tangled up mess of, I don't know, string or fibers. Now this would be in the nucleus. Remember, there's a cell membrane around it as well. So I'm looking inside the nucleus. The DNA is all kind of tangled up. What happens, though, is that DNA makes a copy of itself. And so in this synthesis phase, we get another copy of the DNA. Those copies are arranged in something called sister chromatids. So if we would take the DNA, the white DNA that I started with, and coil it up into a shape, we'd see a bunch of chromosomes. In fact, you have 46 chromosomes in each of your nuclei of your cells. So 46 chromosomes like that. But then when we add that double DNA, that red stringy stuff I just showed, that is created what we call a sister chromatid. So now we've got double the DNA. So again, here is the original DNA, so the original chromosome, but then we have a copy. And that copy, like I showed in red before, is also in red here. Those copies are called sister chromatids. We also call this one chromosome. So this is a chromosome, the whole thing with two sister chromatids, and this is also a chromosome. So we still have 46 chromosomes, but now each chromosome is in a pair called a pair of sister chromatids. Eventually, through mitosis, like we talked about it today in class, we're going to split those sister chromatids in half. So the original one that I showed in white is going to go into one cell's nucleus, and the new one, which I showed in red, is going to go into a second cell's nucleus. So that's why synthesis is so important, is because it's making that extra DNA that eventually can get put into one of those new cells. So after interphase has made the cell bigger, made copies of the chromatids, and then also made those centrioles, the cell is ready to go into the second part of the cell cycle, which we call cell division. So this is actually step 2 of the cell cycle. Cell division is split into 2 parts, the first of which is mitosis. Mitosis is what we talked about in class, so let's do a real quick review of that. That is dividing the information in the nucleus, or dividing the DNA. So your DNA is found in chromosomes. Those chromosomes become visible in prophase. In metaphase, those chromosomes line up down the middle of the cell. In anaphase, the chromosomes separate from each other. And then finally, in telophase, the cell begins to rearrange the nucleus with those separate chromosomes in each. So I like to remember those steps with the acronym PMAT, or PMAT, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. That takes that doubled DNA, or those doubled chromosomes, and split them in half into 2 different nuclei. But the cell isn't quite done yet. It still has to divide the cytoplasm. It still has to split into 2 separate cells. So that final step of cell division, letter B here, we call cytokinesis, which literally means cell movement. And again, this is when the cytoplasm divides. So we split the cells in half, the cytoplasm goes both directions, and we finally end up with 2 cells, each with their own nucleus and their own genetic information. So we successfully made a copy. Okay, let's review it all in one graphic then. So you can see this outer ring of this picture in this light blue color represents the time in a cell's life that it spends in interphase. So it first starts growing in G1, then it makes some extra DNA in the form of sister chromatids, then in G2 it makes centrioles. And you can see that takes up a large portion of a cell's life. Once it's all grown up and ready to divide, then it goes into the mitotic phase, which I called cell division. The first part of that cell division is mitosis. Remember, that's our PMAT, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. So now the chromosomes are in separate nuclei, and the cell can completely split into 2. So here we've got our 2 cells, and then they each start going through interphase again. Grow, make more chromosomes, make more centrioles, and then they can each divide. So in the growth cycle of the cell, most of the time is spent in interphase, and then a short little period of time for a typical cell, about 24 hours, is spent in mitosis. That's it on the cell cycle for now. We will talk lots more about mitosis in class, but for now, don't forget to fill out your questions that go with this video.